Thank you very much for being here. This is the first lecture in our series, Language Models and Intelligent Agentic Systems. We'll do a round of introductions for us, the lecturers. Do you want to come up?
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Brown. I'm a second year PhD student in computer science department. Mostly looking at algebra alignment stuff, reinforcement learning, human feedback, and trying to align languages.
Right. Hi there, I'm Danny. I am the maths department, one of the three of us. I'm doing a stats PhD, but I'm now moving more towards machine learning and collaborating with Jason and Edward on some more AI safety / alignment work.
Great. My name's Edward. I'm in the Department of Engineering. I'm in my final year of my PhD. I study computational neuroscience. I also do some ML stuff. Generally interested in AI and language models. Great. Thanks both. So thanks all for being here. We'll talk a bit about course aims and what we aim to go through over the course of this lecture series. So this lecture is an introduction to language models. So we're just going to go through the basics of what language models are, how they're trained, and then we're sort of going to build up from there over the course of the series. So I'll briefly walk you through the course structure. You've probably already seen this, but if not, it's good to have an idea of where we're heading and what the point of each lecture is, what we're aiming to build. So part one of the course, which is the first 3 lectures, if I recall correctly, is just answering the question of what a language model is, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to answer the question of what at base are language models, how do you train them, and from there we're going to try and answer the question, why does language modeling lead to intelligence? So why is it the case that I can train the system to model language and end up with something that's capable of intelligent action in the real world? Part 2 is on crafting agentic systems. So this is the next few lectures. And in part 2, we're going to focus on how do we turn language models into agents. So how do we turn something that models language into something that we can properly call AI, something that can take actions in the real world, something that can pursue goals, all that kind of stuff. Part 3, we're going to take a deeper look at agentic behavior. So given that we are turning these language models into agents, we're then going to answer the question of what kinds of behaviors do we expect from these agentic systems, and what kinds of behaviors do we see empirically when we extend language models to agents. So broadly, we're going to try and answer the question how our agentic system is going to behave. Part 4, frontiers, is sort of outlooking, and we're going to focus on what the most important problems within AI and language modeling are today. So what are the key issues and concerns that we have? What problems need to be solved, and why do they need to be solved? So it's going to be forward-facing. Great. So what are we going to do today? What's the purpose of today's lecture? Well, today we're going to start by just asking what is a language model, and I'm going to give you some basic definitions, some basic terms, and then we're going to come on to how do we train language models. So after covering what a language model is, we're going to cover how do we train a language model to do the kinds of things that we want it to do. So in particular, we're going to look at generative pre-training as a way of training language models. And then finally, we're going to ask, okay, given that I am training my language model through this generative pre-training process, what do I expect to get out of it? What should the behavior of the language model be following generative pre-training? All right. So let's jump right into the first section of the course. What is a language model? So I'm going to give you 2 different views on what a language model is, a probabilistic view and a generative view. So in the probabilistic view, we're going to take strings of linguistic elements, and I'm being purposely vague here about what I mean by linguistic element, and I'll clarify that in the next slide. We're going to have strings of linguistic elements, and we're going to feed them into, and this is an example, the quick brown fox jumped over the, and blank, right? So the string of linguistic elements, and you can carve up this in many ways, right? You could carve it up into words, you can carve it up into single characters. These are different ways of carving it up into linguistic elements. And I'm going to feed it into my language model. So that's what this arrow is. I'm feeding it into my language model. And my language model is going to output probabilities over the next linguistic element. So in this case, let's take our linguistic elements to be words. So I'm going to feed in this string of words, and my language model is going to spit out probabilities over next words. So here's a bunch of next words that it could possibly be, different things that could follow this string and be the next thing that appears in the sequence. My language model is going to assign to each one of these next words that could appear in the sequence a probability. Right? And at base, that's all a language model is. It's something that takes in sequences of linguistic elements and spits out probabilities over the next linguistic element. All right? So now let's clarify what I mean by linguistic elements. So in the previous example, the elements that I cared about were words. But in general, what language models use, what modern language models use, are not words. So as I said, there's many choices for what we could take as our base linguistic element. One choice is characters. So these are things like A, B, C, punctuation, numbers, and all of the fun like Unicode things, emojis, all of that would count as single characters. The problem with using characters is that in order to express anything, you need a lot of characters in order to express anything with a lot of meaning to it. So the basic issue with characters is that if you look at a single sentence, there's typically many, many characters there, and so your language model would have to predict many of these things. And in a certain sense, each character by itself doesn't contain much meaning. So each individual character, if we chose characters as our linguistic element, has a very small amount of meaning in it. And in general, this isn't the best way to do things because you're just predicting letter after letter. So the next obvious choice is words, right? So yeah, you know what words are. Words are what we used in the previous example. And this is much better because generally words have a lot more meaning to them, and so there's a lot more for the language model to grasp onto. But you run into some issues if you choose words as your elements, which are, what about typos? So lots of text contains typos. If I have to predict full words, how am I going to predict anything that contains a typo in it? Do I just have to have all possible words, including all possible typos of words? This would give a vocabulary that's way too large if I had to include all that. Other problems are neologisms. So these are where you string words together in a novel way, in a way that makes sense but is in itself novel and might not have been done before. And another issue is that if we're looking to carve language at the joints, so looking at a way of carving up language into linguistic elements that sort of are natural, well, characters contain too little meaning, and words contain too much, in the sense that lots of words are made of subwords that themselves have meaning. These are called morphemes. So these are things like ology or right? If you take the word unrest, for example, then this is not there's sub-meaning, there's sub-parts of it that have meaning in and of themselves. So in and of itself has meaning, and this exhibits some sort of compositionality in the structure of the linguistic elements. And we want to be able to capture that. So what we're actually going to use are what we call tokens. So this includes a bunch of words, so really common words that appear a lot. It includes word fragments, so parts of words that appear very often, and this is what can capture those sort of key morphemes that allow us to grasp onto linguistic meaning that exists at the sub-word level. So these are things like re, pre, ology, ing, all of that, so these structures that themselves contain meaning. And it also contains all the characters, right? And so together, tokens can express any word you like, right? Because you give me a word with a typo in, I can at the very least write it out in characters. And if it's a word with a typo in that contains some subwords that are correctly spelled, I can still use those subword fragments that I have. So next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about how exactly we determine which tokens we want to have in our vocabulary of the language model. So this is all the tokens that the language model can interface with, that it recognizes and can output probabilities over. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that next lecture, but this is what we end up going with, these sort of word fragments. Yeah, question?
Do you need the tokens to be do you need a unique mapping from a sentence to token, or is it fine to have many ways to do it?
It is. So it's an interesting question. So when you're generating text, it's fine for there to be multiple ways to generate the same text by carving up the tokens in different ways. But when you're predicting text, you need there to be a or you want there to be a canonical way to divide it into tokens. And there is a canonical way to divide it into tokens. It's called byte pair encoding. And again, we'll talk about that next lecture. Yeah, great. Any other questions at this point? Okay, great. All right, so let's sort of put some maths behind this probabilistic view that we're developing. So this is how I'm going to denote my language model. Probability, that's what the P is for, theta, Tn, T1 up to Tn minus 1. So what do these different symbols mean? So the P is capturing it's a probability. I have a probability of the next token, so Tn is the next token in my sequence, conditional on all of the previous tokens. So T1 up to Tn minus 1 are the previous tokens in the sequence, Tn is the next token, and my language model is just capturing what's the probability of this next token given all these previous tokens, right? And the theta here indicates that generally my language model has some parameters to it. So these are some variables that exist within the language model that can be changed to change this input-output mapping of sequences of previous tokens to probabilities over next tokens, right? Any questions? Great. So if there's lots of parameters, if theta is like, in some sense, there's many of them, then we call it a large language model. Otherwise, it's a small language model. That's all we mean by an LLM, which is probably terminology you've heard. A large language model is just a language model where theta has many, many parameters in it, okay? And by many, we're talking of the order of billions, right? That's sort of the order at which they begin to get large. Awesome. Okay, so in this course, we're going to be focused on what we call neural language models. So in general, this mapping from sequences of input tokens to conditional probabilities over next tokens can be implemented in many, many, many different ways. And there are lots of ways that you can implement such a mapping, some of which contain essentially no parameters at all. But in this course, we're going to focus on neural language models, which are specifically language models for which this mapping is implemented by a neural network. So we have system input, and that's going to be something you type out on the keyboard. And we're going to break this up into tokens using this byte pair encoding algorithm. So this is actually actually tokenized input. And as you can see, it's broken up these into individual words, and the colon gets its own token by itself. And then we're going to map these tokens into their IDs. So each token is given an ID in the vocabulary. This vocabulary is just this long list of all the tokens that the model sort of recognizes. And each token is mapped into its ID. This is the mapping. And then we're going to feed those token IDs into a big neural network with parameters theta, right? And then the neural network is going to spit out at the other end next token ID probabilities, and we're going to map from those IDs to tokens, and this gives us probabilities over next tokens. This all makes sense? Yeah, question.
If someone's using an abbreviation or there's a spelling mistake, how does the mapping take place? Because that word will not happen.
In here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's a spelling mistake, the tokenization will just be different. So if there's a typo, for example, so suppose I switched the S and the Y in system, then a plausible tokenization for that might just be SSY10, right? As like one way of tokenizing it. So if there's, so the tokenizer, which is the thing that does this operation here of mapping from words or like a text string into tokens, takes care of typos by just retokenizing things so that I can express the string that I want. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Those words all start with spaces, or rather those tokens. That seems like it would conflict with being able to compose them into other words. Do you have an intuition why?
Yeah. So in this case, all of these except the system begin with a space. That's really, that's good to notice. So the way tokenization works is, in fact, if you have a token, so say string is one token, you actually have subtokens of that token too. Not all possible subtokens, but typically you sort of build up the tokens in order of frequency. So given that I have string with a space at the start, I almost certainly also have string without a space at the start in my vocabulary, and I could use that as well. Okay. That make sense?
It's just that simpler because like space and then another token is more tokens, right?
Yeah. So space and then token is more. Byte pair encoding is like greedy in the sense that you're like at least moving forward, you're trying to minimize the number of tokens you spit out. So you get to here, and it could output just a space, but it also has in its vocabulary space and then string, and so it outputs that instead. Yeah. Any other questions? Awesome, great. Let's continue. Okay, so we have a big neural network with some set of parameters, and we're going to feed in these token IDs. The neural network is going to process them and spit out probabilities over next IDs. So what does this neural network look like? That's next lecture. So we're not going to do that this lecture. Next lecture, we're going to discuss what this neural network that takes in these IDs and spits out probabilities looks like. And we're going to cover that on Wednesday. Great. So the probabilistic view of a language model is that a language model specifies the conditional probabilities of next tokens given the previous tokens, right? And it's just a probabilistic mapping. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to the generative view. And this is probably, if you've played around with large language models through some interface, either ChatGPT or Claude, then this will be the view that you are more familiar with, that comes more naturally. So the generative view of language models is that once I have this probabilistic mapping, I can do this operation called autoregressive sampling. So I'm going to take an existing string, right? And I take this, and I'll feed it into my language model. Obviously, there's going to be a tokenization step, and then I break it up, and then I feed it in. And the language model is going to spit out probabilities over next tokens, right? And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take that probability distribution, I'm going to sample it from it. So I sample, and in this case, I get can. And then I'm going to take that next token that I've sampled, and I'm going to append it to the end of the string that I've got, right? So I'm going to append it to the end of the string that I've got, and I've got this new string, an existing string can. Feed that in, I get probabilities over next tokens, sample from this distribution, append, feed in, sample, append, and I keep going like that. This makes sense? There's a special token called an end of sequence token, which sort of indicates that I'm sort of done generating. That's in the vocabulary as well, and so when the model reaches sort of the end of its text, it can sample that, and that's how we know that like, it's done with this this batch of text. All right? Any questions about autoregressive sampling? I'll just briefly clear something up. We don't re-tokenize when we append to the string. So instead, we tokenize an existing string, and then we get probabilities of the next tokens, and then we append the token to the list of tokens. You don't go and re-tokenize it as you do the appending. Sort of a subtle point, but I thought I'd clear it up. There's other ways that you can generate text using a language model. There's many ways of doing this, and lots of people do more complicated schemes. We're going to cover one other scheme that's also very simple, which is called greedy sampling, or in some places temperature zero sampling. It's also known as temperature zero sampling for reasons we won't go into. We're going to refer to it as greedy sampling. So in greedy sampling, we feed in our tokenized string, and it gives us a list of probabilities over next tokens. And in greedy sampling, we're always going to sample the most probable token, right? So we're going to sample that token, append, feed in, get new probabilities, sample that token, append, feed in, get new probabilities, sample that token, feed in, append, right? So greedy sampling always samples the most likely token. Very trivial observation, if you autoregressively sample, your language model is going to behave stochastically. You'll get many different generations for the same input. If you greedy sample, your language model will behave deterministically, in that if you feed in, you'll always get the same outputs for the same input. Any questions about these sampling methods? Yeah?
Sorry, I didn't get that earlier, so I thought autoregressive would be greedy sampling. What was an autoregressive? How do I pick it? Just a bit randomly out of the most likely, or?
Right, so the difference between greedy sampling and autoregressive sampling. So in greedy sampling, as we can see, we're always sampling the most likely token. But if I go back to autoregressive sampling, instead, I sample from the full probability distribution, right? In this case, I'm only showing the first three. In actual case, I would look at the entire distribution, and I would sample from that entire distribution. And so there's like a very low chance of getting some very rare tokens and much higher chance of getting more frequent, more probable tokens. Make sense? Yeah. Great. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, so we now covered two views of what language models are. A probabilistic view, which is they take in sequences of tokens and they spit out probabilities over next tokens. And a generative view, which is if I keep doing this operation and sampling or choosing the most likely token, and then appending to my list of tokens, feeding back in, sampling, appending, keep doing this, I can generate text. And this is a generative view of a language model. Great. Now we're going to come to generative pre-training. If you know GPT, this is what GPT stands for, or it stands for generative pre-trained. And yeah, this is the basic operation that you use to train these language models to begin with. This is how the birth of a language model, how it begins its life. And then later we're going to cover how it develops further from there. Okay, so the basic objective for generative pre-training is what we call next token prediction. It's very simple. We know that the language model is meant to spit out probabilities over next tokens. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those probabilities and make them similar to the actual probabilities that you find in real text. Right? Very simple concept. So we're going to get a big bag of documents, and we can get this from many different places. GPT-3 was trained on like various web pages that were outgoing links from Reddit, and a corpus of books, so a large stack of books, and Wikipedia. It saw Wikipedia like 3 times, the entirety of Wikipedia. Great, so we take our big bag of documents that we've got, and we feed it into our tokenizer, and our tokenizer spits out many, many lists of tokens, right? Each document gets converted into a long list of tokens. And so through the tokenization process, we now have this massive pile of lists of tokens. And then the next token prediction objective is very simple. We're just going to try and maximize the probability of each token in the sequence given the prior tokens in the sequence. So what does this look like? So this is the objective. We're going to try and maximize this. This is the next token prediction objective. So for my token sequence, T1 up to Tn, I'm going to look at every token in that sequence, Tn, and I look at all the previous tokens that appear before that. So T1 up to Tn minus 1. Right? Those are my previous tokens that appear in the sequence. And I'm going to look at the probability that my language model assigns to that next token Tn, given T1 up to Tn minus 1. Right? I'm going to take the log of that and sum over all the tokens in the sequence, and I'm just going to try and maximize that. I'm just going to try to increase that as much as possible. So modify the parameters of the language model. That's what J of theta means. It means I've got an objective. It's a function of the parameters of the language model. I'm going to try and update these parameters of the language model, modify them, to maximize the cumulative log probability of each next token in the sequence, given all the tokens that precede it. Right? So this is the objective written for a single token sequence. In practice, I feed in many token sequences in parallel, and I get it to simultaneously increase the probabilities of all those next tokens in all of those sequences at once. And I keep doing update steps to modify these parameters to increase this probability. Right? So you average this over a batch of token sequences. And the way you modify the parameters is using a variant of minimatch gradient descent, or I guess here would be ascent on these on this objective on the model parameters. Does anyone have questions about this?
Why do you use log that would punish really sharply like a small number?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons we use. So one question was, why is there a log in here? One reason, yeah, this is like for like kind of subtle reasons, but like one reason we do it is because we don't want this thing to, we do want to penalize like really, really low probabilities. And we don't want this thing to kind of vanish as we compound over along a sequence. So as you can see, because I've got a sum over a log, I can move this log inside. This then becomes log product of these things. The product of these things then amounts to just the product probability of the entire sequence. So actually what's happening here is the log is allowing me to go from the probability of the entire sequence to a sum over individual probability, to a sum over individual conditional probabilities. There are like deeper reasons we use a log. We're not really going to go into this here because that's more like intro to ML territory. But if you are interested, I can chat to you about it afterwards. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
What would be the probability of predicting the first token? Because then you don't have...
Great question. Yeah, so the question was, what's the probability of the first token? In this case, yeah, our language model also maintains just a prior distribution over initial tokens. One way you can do this is that you have you have an end of sequence token, you also have a beginning of sequence token, and then just ask the language model what's most likely to follow a beginning of sequence token. Right? And then, yeah, it also has to predict, like, how do sequences typically start? Yeah. Other questions? Fantastic. Great. So we've covered what a language model is, and we've covered how we train it initially, this generative pre-training process. Now we're going to look at what generative pre-training gets you. What do you actually get once you've done this process? So you can think of documents as text as containing many tasks that require different knowledge and skills. So if you compare, for example, I mean, the easiest way to see this, for example, is textbooks, right? You have a history textbook and a biology textbook and a mathematics textbook, right? Predicting what happens next in these textbooks requires a very diverse set of knowledge that the language model has to internalize if it's going to be able to predict what happens next in these books. So you're mathematicians. You may have heard this advice that if you're working through a textbook that contains many proofs, what you should do as you're working through it is you get to a theorem, and before you read the proof of the theorem, you cover it up and try to work out how you would prove it yourself, right? And this is a pedagogical exercise you can use to try to get better at proving theorems. And this is essentially just what we're asking the language model to do when we train it on a maths textbook, that it sees a theorem, and then it sees the token proof, and then we ask it what happens next. And then another part of this exercise is if you can't get it, if you can't work out what the proof is, you read the first line, and then you try to work out what the rest is. How does it go from there? And again, this is exactly what we're asking the language model to do, right? It sees the first line of the proof, and we ask it what comes next, right? So when we train these language models on text that contains difficult to solve problems or requires deep knowledge of something, for example, a biology textbook, we're asking it repeatedly, try to guess what happens next. And doing this well requires you to internalize all that knowledge that exists in that corpus of text. So one way to conceptualize tasks is one way to conceptualize text that we pre-train the language model on is as this very large, diverse set of tasks that we're training the language model to do. And in, I think, the third lecture, we're going to see that this is a very valid way to think about what's happening when you train a language model. So I just want to give some examples of various subtasks that are involved in the language modeling process. So if you're reading a novel and you have to predict what happens next in the novel, that requires some degree of theory of mind. You have to keep track of who knows what, who wants what they're trying to pursue, why they do the things they do, right? And you have to try to predict, on the basis of that, what their next action is going to be. So it requires some theory of mind to predict the actions of people in text or in historical documents, for example. Many text also contains descriptions of the physical world and actions happening in the physical world and their consequences. And so if you're going to predict what happens in that text, you need to understand a basic level of physics. What happens when you push an object? What happens when you throw something? How does wind affect things? All of this, right? Understanding history, again, it's seen Wikipedia 3 times. That's a lot of historical knowledge, right? And so in order to predict what happens in those documents, it has to internalize a basic sense of what happened when, what events follow others. Does it make sense for one document that happened that is clearly written after another to reference that? If it happened before, then no, all this kind of stuff. Understanding science, then any kind of science web pages, science textbooks, predicting what happens next requires some knowledge of biology and chemistry. And finally, if you have maths papers that you feed it in, then you have to understand abstract reasoning to predict what happens next in the sequence. And this is just some examples of many of the subtasks involved in modeling language. So I just wanted to go through sort of an example of what it looks like during the generative pre-training process, what the outputs of the model look like. So here I have a loss versus training steps curve for my language model. We're going to train it. We're going to see what happens to the text the language model generates on this held out data as we do. And this is all fictitious. I haven't actually trained a language model. I don't have that level of compute. So right at the start, oh yeah, and the prompt that we're going to get the language model to continue is a sentence from a fictitious ML paper. This doesn't really exist. There's no ML paper with a sentence in. I made it up. But from this, if you take someone like Jason, who's like deep within the field, you could guess what would come next, right? And we're going to see what happens to the language model as we make this loss go down. So first thing, before the language model is trained at all, when it hasn't trained at all, it's just going to output random tokens, right? Because basically it's just maintaining this like random distribution over tokens. And so at each time step, you're just sampling a random token and you just append them and you get garbage. It's gibberish. It doesn't make any sense. It's probably not even grammatical. So as loss begins to go down, what's the first thing you can do? What's the first thing that you learn as a language model? Well, you're going to learn things like the basic frequency of words. You're going to learn that tokens like colon, 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 right, don't appear that often. They're not frequent tokens, so it's a bad idea to guess them. You're going to do really badly if you guess them. Whereas tokens like the and at appear very often, and so they're good guesses, right? And so the first bit of the loss that's going to go down is just going to be due to guessing the basic frequency of words in the text. You still don't understand anything about semantics, you don't understand any syntax, you know what the words mean, you know what order they should go in, but you know the basic frequency, and this gets you some loss, gets you down some way from just guessing at random. Okay, but then the loss is going to go down further. So what's the next thing to fall? What's the next thing the language model will get? Well, at this point, it can begin to get basic syntax, right? So it can learn like, oh, okay, I should like arrange these words in such a way that makes syntactic and grammatical sense. It's massively off topic. It doesn't know what we're talking about. It doesn't have any understanding of what's behind the words, but it can at the very least continue sentences in ways that are grammatically correct. And this gets you some more loss. You go down some more. What's next to fall after that? Well, once I've mastered the basic structure, I then have to go on to semantics, right? And I have to go on to understanding the actual meaning of the terms and clock that, like, okay, this is an ML paper. We're in ML land, so I should be using ML terms, right? What's the best thing I can guess if I do know the meanings of things? Well, I know this is an ML paper. I can guess that from all this. And so I should begin to guess things that are related to ML and begin to throw in those words there. But it's just jargon, right? This doesn't actually make any sense. It's just throwing a bunch of ML terms at the wall to see if it can get anywhere with that. But then the loss has got to go down more. So what do you learn after that? Once you're done with this very basic pattern matching of just like, we're in ML territory, okay, throw ML terms out there. What are you going to guess after that? Well, the next thing you've got to do is start memorizing like actual facts about fields, learning basic details. And so the next thing it's going to do is just regurgitate things that it's read before. So this is not a million miles off. This is the unmodified Bradley-Terry loss. But it hasn't learned any level of understanding yet of like how do I modify this in light of what I've read previously. It's just regurgitating facts back at me, right? And so it's captured now, it's gone through syntax, it's gone through semantics, it's now got facts, it knows things about the world, but doesn't yet have a deep understanding of how do you modify things in light of new information? How do you put facts together to reach novel conclusions? But the loss has got to go down further, and so what falls last? Well, that last bit of the loss that's going to take the rest of the training run to get, that's going to give you an understanding of what's going on and allow you to actually guess correct answers to these things. So if the loss is going to keep going down, then eventually you master more and more aspects of language, right? You master basic frequency, then you master syntax, semantics, just pattern matching, meanings of things, facts, and finally you have to start understanding what's going on in the text if you're going to do really well at this, right? Great. And so the question then is like, how far does this loss go down? Do we reach that point? And we're going to cover that in lecture 3. So lecture 3, we're going to discuss this a bunch more, and we're going to discuss how we can predict how far the loss is going to go down from how big our model is. Yeah, any questions at this point? We'll just pause briefly. Yeah.
Is there some research using classifier or something to analyze the order how language model learns something? So you present it in a way, but you could also kind of, they probably overlap at one point, right?
I think I know someone who's doing this kind of thing. I can like direct you towards them. I don't think there's a whole bunch of stuff on like the sort of developmental psychology of language models, which I think is a shame, because I think it would be very interesting to see it. Yeah.
Are LLMs now trained to guess what happens next? Do they also happen to be good at predicting what happened before or like next after like 5 sentences, or do they need to be trained differently?
So if you're good at predicting the next token, you're very good at it, then if you just like keep sampling, then you can get good at predicting things that happen like way down the line. But if you're asking, can I like directly predict things? So in some modern like LLM training runs, they do in fact predict more than just the next token. They predict, for example, the next 5 tokens. So sometimes we do predict like out from there. But then, yeah, if I'm good at predicting like what happens immediately, then if I just extrapolate outwards, I can get good at predicting, or I will be good at predicting things that happen a while away as well.
But you never go back, like you never try to predict what happened before.
So some language models do like non-causal predictions, which mean that they can predict like what's happening in like the middle of the sentence from all the things around it. If you have a language model that's trained in this non-causal way, then it's not going to be optimized for autoregressive sampling, and so it's not going to be as good as at generating text. Whereas if you train specifically on next token prediction rather than just like predicting the middle token in a long sequence of tokens, then you'll be like better at specifically generating text, which is typically what we want to use the language models for in the end.
Yeah, to address your question a bit more, there's something called the reversal curse in modern LLMs, where you can have lots of training data where they learn A equals B, and there's a very, very low correlation with them being able to say B equals A. It's just not really a fact that LLMs learn from this training method.
Okay, great. So yeah, in lecture 3, we're going to discuss this this whole stuff more about like how far down is the loss going to go, given the size of my language model. All right. So the basic thing that I'm trying to express to you here is that next token prediction is a really difficult task. It's very tricky to get like very, very good at. So if you get just a little bit good at it, then it's actually pretty easy. You don't learn a whole lot. You just learn things like word frequency and syntax, and it's not very interesting. If you get a little bit better at it, you start to pick up semantics. You can pattern match to being in a certain situation, and you pick up some facts that you can regurgitate out. But if you're going to get extremely good, like if you're really going to push it and get very, very good, then doing it well requires like actually understanding the things that you're saying and having a very robust model that you can then prod and probe to access new information and put new facts together. A text corpus, right, that we train these models on, that we do generative pre-training in, can be seen as just a massive curriculum of tasks, right? We have many, many, many tasks within that text corpus that require understanding many different aspects of the world, knowing many different facts, putting these facts together in novel ways, all of this. So the text corpus contains many of these different tasks, and generative pre-training forces you to learn all of these tasks simultaneously, right? It's just this big curriculum of all of these things that you can ask the model to learn, and then you train it to try to get better and better at all these tasks. And if you get good at next token prediction, you get good at a lot of other things. And this is what we're going to see throughout the rest of the course, that once you've done this generative pre-training and you've absorbed the knowledge that's in this corpus, you have a lot of latent abilities that can be brought out to do various other things at later stages. Okay, yeah, so the final part of the lecture, just check time. Yeah, so in the final part of the lecture, I'm just going to cover like how you should think about these pre-trained systems. And in particular, I want to make sure that you understand that these pre-trained systems behave quite differently to the LLMs that you may have interacted with. So if you've interacted with these sort of assistant or chatbot LLMs, like Claude or ChatGPT, then these pre-trained LLMs behave like very differently from that. So after pre-training, when you autoregressively sample from an LLM, then you're continuing text in a plausible way, right? In like the way that the LLM sees as most likely. And most text that you train the LLM on in this generative pre-training process is not a dialogue of some kind. It's not, one person asking an assistant something and the assistant asking something back. Instead, it's just a mess of like lots of things, right? Paragraphs and paragraphs of prose or scientific research, all of this stuff, or code, right? And so I'm just going to run through some examples of the kinds of outputs you get from these systems following generative pre-training, but before you do any kind of further modifications. So if you go to ChatGPT and you ask something like, tell me how to fine-tune a model, it'll answer something like, fine-tuning a model involves adjusting the parameters of the pre-trained model in order to make it better, right? So it acts as an assistant and answers your question, right? Whereas if you take the base model and you type in, tell me how to fine-tune a model, so this is the base model is the one that's gone through generative pre-training, but no further modifications. Just that, just the generative pre-training. You ask it, tell me how to fine-tune a model. Well, that sentence by itself, what kind of text does that usually occur in? What kind of thing do you expect to see following that sentence? Well, one place you'd see that is, for example, in a drop-down menu on a website of the different articles they have, or in links to, here are different posts on a forum, right? And that's exactly what it's decided this text is. So it's decided that this is one article heading or one link heading, and then the completion it generates is just a bunch of other article headings, right? So it hasn't answered the question. It's just generating or continuing the text in the most plausible way it can. And to really hammer this home, here's another example. So the thing that you've typed in is, are bugs real? And then you're letting the model auto-regressively generate from there. This is, again, the base model. And it says, like, okay, someone's asking, are bugs real? What's the most likely text for me to be generating here? And the answer is, it's probably a dialogue between a kid and an adult, right? And that's what it decides is going on. So it closes the question with a quotation mark, and it decides it's speech. And then it continues it as a dialogue between a kid and an adult. Are bugs real? They're very real. So real that some people say they're the best reason to keep your teeth brushed. Right? It's great. But it's not answering questions, right? So if you go to ChatGPT and you ask, like, are bugs real? It will, I don't know, tell you some stuff about how bugs are real. But the base model doesn't answer questions, right? It's not a question answering system. It just continues the text in plausible ways. What about this one? So if you go to ChatGPT and you type in, say this is a test, then it will probably reply like, this is a test. I don't know. But it will follow the instruction that you give it. Whereas if you put it into the base model continues the text in a plausible way. Lots of text contains dialogue, right? Like books are full of dialogue. And it continues this text as dialogue again. Say this is a test and you're here to give me my big break. You won't make the mistake of saying that. Say what? Say this is a test? It's kind of nonsense. I really enjoy this dialogue. It really doesn't make any sense. But the point is that it's not an instruction following system, right? It doesn't follow the instructions you give it. Instead, it continues it as a dialogue between someone giving the instruction and someone receiving the instruction. Because, I don't know, that's how you see a lot of instructions that you see in the wild in text documents. So it's not a question answering system. There's not an instructions following system. Instead, what it does is it has learned the basic rules of physics that animate text, the basic progression of having seen this in the text, what's likely to come next? How is the text likely to progress, right? And so all it does is roll out from there and keep applying these rules and try to move the text forward in the most likely way possible. It has no interest in answering your questions or following your instructions. You can get it to, but you have to sort of carefully engineer a context for the model where answering the question is the most likely thing to happen next in the text. Okay, so given this, how do you go from a pre-trained model, which continues text plausibly, just animating text in the most likely way, to an assistant that follows instructions and answers questions? That's lecture 4. So we'll come back to that in the beginning of part 2, and part 2 will just all be about this question of how do I get a system that continues text plausibly, and how do I turn it into an assistant that follows instructions and answers questions. Okay, we're at the end of the lecture. I'll briefly take any questions you have before we just wrap up. Great, okay. So let's just recap what we covered today. So language model is a mapping from sequences of tokens to probabilities over next tokens. A neural language model is a mapping that's implemented by a neural network, and on Wednesday, so in the next lecture, we'll cover what this neural network looks like. You can generate text using a language model by either autoaggressively or greedily sampling from them. And the way the way a language model begins its life is through this process called generative pre-training, which involves training a language model to predict the next token within a large corpus of text. We covered that next token prediction is hard, and if you're going to get very good at it, if you're going to really push that loss down really far, then you have to understand the rules behind the text. You have to understand the processes that generate that text. That requires a lot of understanding of the world, of various facts, of like why people write text and what they're trying to convey. And this requires a lot of understanding. And in lecture 3, we're going to cover this in a lot more detail, and we're going to look at the question of, okay, given how big my language model is, how low is this loss going to get? Right, that's the topic of lecture 3. And finally, we covered that following generative pre-training, my language model is not an assistant, it doesn't answer questions, it doesn't follow instructions. It is a simulator that animates the basic rules of text, and it just continues the text in the most plausible manner that we have. And in lecture 4, we're going to cover how people turn these sort of systems that just continue text plausibly, how do you turn it into a question answering system or an instruction following system. Thank you all very much.